Okay, guys, so I hope that you've all gotten a chance to download the handout. If not, send me an email and ask me for it. I won't be able to do it ahead of time, but you can. My email is now in the chat feature. It's cross@cb.law. And this is what the handout looks like. And my hope is, however you want to interact with this information, you'll have that chance. So you can read about it, you can watch it, or at some point I'll be able to cut just the audio and throw it on as a podcast. But this one specifically is about option money. And I wanted to talk about it, how it is used in the Georgia Association of Realtors contract. Option money in general is when you're paying money for the option to buy something or sell something or whatever it may be, but you're paying for it. You're actually writing a check or sending money for that right. And the GAR contract is no different. So here's why this is such a big deal right now. Let's give you a hypothetical. We've got this really weird real estate market in 2020 where, expensive properties and cheap properties alike are just flying off the market with multiple offers. And you are doing your darndest to get attention, to get your contract noticed by the seller. And obviously price is a big part, contingencies is a big part, how much you're putting down and how quickly you can close. Those are all really, really important topics. Sometimes that's not enough. If you're bidding on a $500,000 property, you might have 10 offers that you're competing against. And that's pretty overwhelming, especially if your client has to sell their property first. Or if there's a 30-day financing contingency that we're having to fight for. And we're talking about $1 here or $1 there. We don't have a whole lot that we can really compete with. Well, this is another tool in your arsenal. And I was talking to someone the other day who said, they were asking one of their colleagues about option money, and they said, oh, call Christian, he loves option money. And I do, for this reason. It can really turn the tables for you and hopefully give you a little bit of an advantage, but there are some downsides as well. And there are certainly people that don't like using the option money. So it's in F201, right on the first page of the contract, Section 8, inspection and due diligence. So you're used to just filling out the first part. So due diligence period, properties being sold subject to a due diligence period of, and there's a blank and it has, the number of days from the binding agreement date. So, you might try and do 7 days when you're dealing with multiple offers, or maybe even 5. I love that as an option. But if we look at B, so this is 8B, option payment for due diligence period. So this is where you would put in a number, an amount that you could use, that you would pay the seller for the right to have a due diligence period. That's how the contract is drafted. So let's read it first. So buyer 1 has paid seller $10 of non-refundable option money. That's this whole, $10 paid in hand. It's legalese for us attorneys to say that when something has been paid, consideration has been given for the right to have option or to have your due diligence. But the second part of that, so B2, is where you could actually put money in. So seller, or it shall pay seller additional option money of, and it has a blank, by check or wire transfer of immediate available funds paid by buyer to seller, which shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price. So let's think about that. You're not used to using this. Let's just say that in general. We've got maybe the right, or we want to be able to kind of get ahead of the other parties. We can't necessarily offer more money. You start coming up against appraisal issues. Maybe we have a financing contingency that we're having, the lender's saying we need 45 days instead of the normal 30. You say, hey, look, what if we use option money to say, I'm going to pay the seller this money now, right at the binding agreement date. I'm going to write you a check for $1,500 or $5,000, whatever the number is that based on the purchase price gets the seller's interest. And even if I terminate under the due diligence period later on, or if I terminate under the financing contingency, or if I terminate under the sale or lease contingency, even if I do those things, the seller keeps that money. And it's basically to pay them for taking the house off the market. That's what it is, for accepting your offer, even though you have those contingencies. I love that. So let's go through it. In my scenario, buyer makes an offer on a property but has to compete with other offers with fewer contingencies. They need to level the playing field. How can we help them overcome and get under contract? So that's how you would do it. You say, look, I was going to give you $5,000 as earnest money. It's a $500,000 property. I was ready to give you that 1%. Well, what if we took half of that? $2,500 we use as option money, and $2,500 we keep as earnest money. And if I have to later terminate because the appraisal came in too low and I can't afford to buy the property under that appraisal amount, seller's going to keep their $2,500 option money, and I'll get back my $2,500 as earnest money. The seller, obviously they would prefer that the property sell, but that $2,500 could be used to pay their mortgage that month, to pay for movers, to buy, pay for a rent or a lease for 1 month or whatever it may be, just money in their pocket to help them withstand later getting denied for the appraisal contingency. And for a buyer, that's just going to be the cost they pay for having a shot at goal, right? So they had a chance to buy this property, and unfortunately in their scenario, the appraisal fell through. That is a really, really great option. Now, we're also going to talk about some of the downsides of this option money contract and what we don't like about it. But first, let's talk about the history of option money. So this is before, a little bit before I was a closing attorney, but several years ago, the GAR Forms Committee wanted to help parties combat an influx of buyers putting offers on property sight unseen. So you'd have this investor that would go and make an offer on a Saturday for 30 different properties, and maybe realistically they could buy 1 or 2. And so this option money was designed as a way to combat that, where if you knew they were investors, if you knew there was a potential that they hadn't even seen the property, they were just making an offer so that they could later on make up their mind, this would make it more real, even if it was a $250 option money. So the practice would be to put multiple properties under contract and prior to the end of DD, terminate all but one of them. And the committee added the option money section to compensate a seller, even if the buyer chose to terminate later under one of the contingencies. So if we look at that field, let me share the screen so I can show you the actual form. So here it is right here. This is Section 8, inspection and due diligence. Again, we're used to only looking at A, which is the due diligence period. So we're going to put, say, 7 days from the binding agreement date. We put that there. 1 is what would normally apply, and that's just to apply for that consideration to make sure that the contract was legally enforceable. 2, this is where I'm recommending you look, shall pay seller additional option money of blank by check or wire of immediately available funds, and then you get to choose when it's going to be paid. So as of the offer date or within so many days of the binding agreement date. And then this last sentence, any additional option money paid to buyer or by buyer to seller shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price at closing and shall not be refundable to buyer unless the closing fails due to the default of the seller. So a couple of things going on there. First, amount. I would recommend that a portion of what you were willing to put down as earnest money be applied as option. So in a $500,000 property, multiple offers, maybe you were even thinking of putting $10,000 down to entice the seller. Well, let's split some portion of that up. Let's say, well, I know I'm asking for a lot. I need a 30-day financing contingency. I'll put $2,500 that pays for their mortgage that month. Or maybe I need to make it $3,500 or $5,000. And then let's say it's $5,000 for option money. And then I'll also put $5,000 for earnest money. And that way I'm still putting 10 grand down. It'll all get applied towards my purchase price if you select the right section at the bottom there. And obviously, if the worst case scenario happens, I'm out the option money. That's that's the idea. So 2 is timing. So this depends on the specific situation. So there really are 2 situations you might use option money. One is that multiple offer scenario, the thing we're seeing most often this year. The other option is when I first really started thinking about option money, and that is when you have these sale or lease contingencies, even if it's not a multiple offer. Let's say it's just one offer, it's your offer. And the buyer says, hey, look, I'll put $20,000 down as earnest money, but I need a sale or lease contingency because I have to sell my house first. And you say, oh, I don't really like that. When is your house going to sell? And they say, well, it's not even on the market, but it's going to go on the market on Saturday or whatever the timing is. And then it's going to be 30 to 45 days from the day we get an offer in order for us to close. So now we're asking the seller to potentially wait 2 months, 2.5 months, whatever it may be. Let's say it's 45 to 60 days. That's a lot. And then if for any reason, all the way up until closing, the buyer's sale falls through. Maybe their financing falls apart. Maybe their appraisal contingency falls apart. Now you have a seller who loses their buyer because their closing failed. We've waited for a month or 45 days where the house has not been on the market or has been subject to a kickout clause. We'll talk about it in a second. And the seller, guess what happens to that earnest money? Does the seller get any of it? No, they don't get any of it, which I hate for the seller. That's I think historically the listing agents that were trying to protect against that, the only tool they really used and maybe still only use is, well, we're going to make sure that there's no sale or lease contingency. We're going to take that off the table. And if your property doesn't sell, well, then you'll lose your earnest money. Well, that's not exactly how earnest money works. I think this is a safer way to do it. So let's keep going. So the timing of things, those 2 situations depend on how you're going to do your timing. So if you're competing against multiple offers, I would suggest that you make the option money payable as of the offer date. And so that's this section right here. Let's see if I can spotlight it. So as of the offer date, I would select this first box. So I'm trying to compete. I'm going to write $5,000 earnest money, and I'm going to write $5,000 option monies for a total of $10,000 down on this deal. That's a buyer who's very serious. I love that. Alternatively, let's say you're the only offer, or you're the best offer by far, but you have that sale contingency. I would make it due after your due diligence. So, hey, I want to give you this option money. I want this property. I'm really excited, but let me do my inspection first. So in that scenario, you would select the second box. So within so many days from buying agreement date. So if you've got a 7-day due diligence, I want the option money to be payable on the 8th day. Or if it's a 10-day due diligence, I want it payable on the 11th day. And the thinking there is, if the inspection shows me something I don't like, or the seller won't negotiate with me on repairs, I can back out before I lose my option money. You may not have that if you're competing for multiple offers. You may just have to take that risk. But when you're really just negotiating over these contingencies, I think having it due the day after due diligence ends is a really good option for all parties involved. Because if you're representing the seller, you're going to advise the seller, say, hey, look, I think this makes sense. They're going to put $20,000 down, $10,000 earnest money, $10,000 option money. The earnest money is payable immediately. And then as soon as due diligence ends, they'll write that another 10 grand. So if we get through due diligence, if we're reasonable with them, if there are no major issues, you're going to have $20,000 down, and half of it is non-refundable entirely. And then so that's what I would recommend for those 2 scenarios. The third option that you have is whether it shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price. I would say, the standard is that it is applied towards the purchase price, because otherwise it's a little confusing. But I would just say it is. And if you have to waive it, that's fine. Just understand how that works. So in my scenario, you're putting $20,000 down total, $10,000 is option money. if you're going to make that 10,000 applied towards the purchase price, then the buyer will see a credit on their settlement statement of 10,000 plus the 10,000 earnest money, just like you're used to seeing. Right at the top, the settlement statement is going to show that deposit. It's just there are going to be two of them. If you don't do that, then only 10,000 will be shown as a credit on the settlement statement, and that's the earnest money. The 10,000 you paid in option money, that doesn't matter anymore. And you essentially, if we're netting it all out, you paid $10,000 more than the actual purchase price. That could be fine. That's not a problem. It's all about how you negotiated with the seller. So those are those three things in this form that you really need to pay attention to. But ultimately, you're using this to either elevate yourself in the priority of other offers or incentivize, aka compensate, the seller for accepting a long contingency, such as the sale contingency. Continuing the example above, so a buyer really wants the seller to accept their offer. Faced with removing either the financing appraisal contingency or removing the sale contingency, the option money might be much safer. So let's talk about what that means. What happens if you waive your sale contingency? You have $20,000 of earnest money down on the table. You've waived your sale contingency just to be competitive, or because you had a kickout clause, and the kickout clause makes the buyer waive their contingencies. Well, then all of a sudden, the week before closing, your sale falls apart. Obviously, a lot of people believe that the only remedy there, the only real issue is that you lose your 20,000 earnest money, but that's not the case. What is the other remedy? Who else has a remedy in this scenario? If someone can answer me that in the questions, I would love for you to say in the chat feature what you think the other remedy. What is the other shoe that will fall on the buyer? So in that scenario, the buyer has $20,000 of earnest money down. They're financing appraisals and everything. Kim, you nailed it. The brokers can sue for commission. So on a $500,000 deal, that buyer is going to lose 20 grand of earnest money. You've waived your sale contingency, so you're not getting that earnest money back. That's the default to the seller. And then the brokers, maybe not your selling agent, maybe the selling agent's like, hey, let's just go find something you can actually get or afford. But now the listing agent or the selling agent can sue for 6% commission, which is another 30 grand. So you could have a buyer potentially facing $50,000 in liabilities plus attorney's fees. That's nasty. And so what I would recommend is you tell your buyer why you're thinking option money, why this is a good option. And the reason is you would be able to keep your sale contingency. Yes, the option money is non-refundable, but if you terminate under a sale contingency, even though you lost your option money, you're not going to get sued for commissions because you terminated under a contingency. You're not going to get your option money back. You will get your earnest money back. So in that scenario, buyer gets their $10,000 earnest money, loses their $10,000 option money, but is protected from being sued for commissions. So I really love that option because honestly, the listing agent, they're going to live to fight another day. Hopefully they don't lose the listing or it expires for any reason in that scenario. That's just the cost of doing business if they lose that sale and they have to start over again. But then the selling agent, hopefully, again, you're not going to lose that buyer, that you're going to have a chance to rebound and find something that the buyer really can afford or the timing, lines up again. And then it also gives you some other options. You could convert that remaining earnest money. So again, in that scenario, 10,000 option money, 10,000 earnest money. Your option money is already done. That's gone. But you got 10,000 earnest money that's going to go back to the buyer. What if you can say, hey, seller, I will convert that last earnest money into option money. It'll be distributed to you immediately. And so now the seller's got $20,000 total, but give me 2 weeks. Give me a month to go find something, to find a new buyer. This is just a hiccup. Give me another minute. And make sure it all is applied towards the buyer's purchase at closing. And maybe you even rent it from them as well. So they're going to get the $20,000 in that scenario, and then maybe you give them a $2,500 rent payment for the month to buy some time and hope that the buyer can come through on their sale. So that is how this works. For the seller, guaranteed payment of the option money paid directly to the seller prior to closing. In fact, it's usually paid right at the binding of the contract, which is really nice. They can use it for moving expenses. They could use it towards their own purchase, whatever it may be. This is not refunded even if the buyer later terminates under the sale or lease contingency. And for a buyer, they get the deal. They can convince the seller to sell it to them. That's the key. So outside of that benefit, if the buyer later terminates with a contingency and forfeits that option money, at least they're terminating with a contingency and not subjecting themselves to being sued for commissions. If you can help it, we don't want to waive contingencies that are crucial to our buyer. I would rather convert all the earnest money into option money, payable directly to the seller immediately, but keep my contingencies, keep my ability to terminate. And as a listing agent, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter as a listing agent because most listing agents are not suing for commission. And maybe that's the being devil's advocate on this deal. So we'll finish up by looking at what we don't like about option money. So what we don't like about it is brokers are giving up their ability to sue. And there's a lot of leverage when it comes to that. You can really scare a buyer or a seller into closing if that's the case. If you have that power to sue for commissions, that's really powerful. And I'm not saying you're going to do it every time, but reminding a buyer or seller to follow the contract because you have that leverage is key. I don't like giving up leverage if I don't have to. So from a broker's perspective, I think that's a big deal. We want everyone to validate and do the contract if they can. But again, if the buyer is not getting their appraisal and can't close with it, then what good is that leverage anyways? So Pat asks, how does option money affect appraisals? It doesn't affect it at all. As long as you're able to keep your appraisal contingency, if the appraisal comes in low, you could terminate, and the seller keeps the option money, and the buyer gets back their earnest money. It doesn't affect the cost of the appraisal or what it needs to appraise for, except for maybe one scenario. And I think this is maybe getting a little too complex, but if you chose the option to not have it apply towards the purchase price, so you took that 10 grand and that's just going to be above and beyond the purchase price. It's not going to be a credit to the buyer. Well, now your appraisal really only has to be $10,000 less than the total. So, if it's $500,000 and you're paying $10,000 option money not to be credited towards purchase price, now your appraisal really only needs to be $500,000, not 510. 510 is what you're actually paying. 500 is what the appraisal needs to be. I think that's probably getting too complex. Again, I would default to having it apply towards purchase price. And then if you have appraisal issues later, you can deal with that later the way you normally would. That's the big one. And then, the big issue that we have to really contend with on option money is you have to educate the other broker involved. You have to educate the buyer. You have to educate the seller. And that's asking a lot in some circumstances because this is different. This is not something every broker knows about. This is not something that every buyer or seller has done. This is a little unusual. I would say I probably see option money on less than 5% of my deals. Maybe it's less than 3% of my deals. And I really only see it when you've got brokers and buyers and sellers that are just fighting to make a deal work. So in that scenario, you put an offer together, you have $1,500 as option money and $3,500 as earnest money, and they take that and they're like, what is option money? What? I don't get it. Why, look at all these contingencies and why don't you just waive the contingent? That's tough. You have to jump on a phone call, try to convince the listing agent that your deal is actually money in your seller's pocket that they're going to get immediately, that you're doing this to incentivize them. But if they don't want it, we don't have to do it. So I don't want you to, overly complicate a deal when you don't have to. But if you can communicate it correctly, or if the other broker understands it already, I think it could be really great. So Stacy asks, is there any scenario where you can write a special stip where option money could come back to buyer if there's a big problem about the property that comes to light during inspection and due diligence? Yes, Stacy, there is. Two things I can answer on that one. One, you can make the option money due after due diligence. So if you're really worried about that property and you just need a couple of days, we go binding on Sunday night, the inspection is scheduled for Tuesday morning, we'll know by Tuesday afternoon. On Wednesday, you could make the option money due. So if that's a really gnarly inspection, you wouldn't write the check, you would just terminate, or you would negotiate with the seller ahead of time, something like that. So that's number one option, is just make it payable after due diligence. And the other option is, if you find a massive title issue, and honestly, as a closing attorney, that's what I worry about, something that I can't overcome. And the seller is going to be in default. Per the contract, if the seller defaults, the option money is returned to the buyer. So think about that. We've paid the option money. It says non-refundable on the sheet, on the contract, unless the seller is in default. But there's a problem with that, and this is where it gets complicated. And this goes to Pat's question: who holds the earnest money, or who holds the earnest money? Is held by either the broker or the closing attorney. The option money is actually paid directly to the seller. So the seller already has the option money in their bank. They may have already spent it. And now the seller's in default. There's some issue with title, and he has to return it to the buyer. Hopefully. The seller's not an escrow agent. They're not a closing attorney. They're not a broker. That money is actually being used. So unless you have really upstanding moral character, it's possible that a seller could say, I'm not paying it, or just not answer emails, not actually write the check. That's a problem. So as a buyer, I'm telling a buyer, look, this is how the contract is read, but worst case scenario, you may never get this money back. If there's a major issue, the seller's getting a divorce, there's no money to pay liens or loans or whatever it may be, that is not the person we want to get a check back from. So that's the downside. That's something that I can't really contend with so much unless you made it payable to someone else. But that's the whole point of option money, is that it's paid to the seller. It's to incentivize the seller. Maybe you can just play with the timing a little bit. So I hope that's helpful. There's a question. So Robin asks, is the option money ever held in the broker's trust account, or is it paid directly to the seller once due? The answer is that it's the way the contract is written, it's always paid to the seller. The only other special stip I could think to do, and again, I don't want to overcomplicate deals for you guys. I want to keep it simple. I want to use the contract the way it was intended. But the one thing I have done before is you pay $10,000 as earnest money immediately. And then you do a special stip that says, upon the waiver or expiration of due diligence, $5,000 of the earnest money shall be converted into option money and paid directly to the seller per section 8B2. So that's an option. That basically it's converted into option money at a later date. And I have used that before. It's a little complicated, but it certainly could be done. Again, you're just gonna have to educate. And I think that's one of the downsides of option money, is that if you're having to educate people too much, they lose focus on why this is actually a good thing, why this could be great. Pat says, could the broker hold it if they all agree? Absolutely. You do a special stip that says the option money shall be paid directly to listing broker per the terms of the agreement or something. Keep it really simple, but that would be fine. But you're protecting against a seller not being able to sell the property for some title issue, which, I mean, if you think about it, guys, I don't know how many of those issues you've ever had in your career. I have those issues once a quarter where I can't close it. Now, I may have to work really hard on, every other day for a file, But once a quarter, there's a deal that just can't close. I have one right now that was a tax deed. So the seller or the prior owner never paid their property taxes. The county foreclosed. And now this guy, he went and he did what's called a quiet title action. He did the wrong quiet title action. So it's a lawsuit. He didn't do it the right way. And now I can't insure his title. So he's got to go back. He's got to, do another lawsuit, open up under a new Georgia statute. But you might be able to figure that out ahead of time. If it's not a tax sale, if there's, not a death or a divorce or something along those lines, if it's not a bankruptcy or a short sale or anything of that nature, you could probably understand that all these issues are resolvable. They may take time, they may have delays, but they're resolvable. They're things we can find solutions for. So I hope that's helpful as well. Those are great questions. So someone asks, to be clear, the language indicates that the additional option money is not refundable to buyer unless the closing fails to occur due to the default of the seller, regardless of whether the money is applied to the purchase price or not. So the form is saying that shall or shall not be applied towards purchase price at closing, but in both cases, the option money is not refundable unless the seller default. That's correct. The whole point of option money is that it is paid and it is non-refundable because you have an option to terminate. You are paying for the option to terminate. That's what you're paying for. The only scenario where the option money would get paid back would be if you had a title issue and the seller could not close, or the seller didn't show up to closing, just said, I'm having trouble buying a new house, and so I don't want to close anymore. Can a seller do that? No, sellers can't do that. That would be default, and they can't keep their option money or do any of that. But again, I don't see that all that often either. Maybe a couple times a year where you have a seller that doesn't realize what they signed. And those are easy conversations for me to have with them and kind of convince them that that's not a good avenue for them to go down. Deshanta asks, if the special stip states that part of the earnest money to be converted to the option money, who will cut that check directly to the seller is the person holding earnest money? That's right. Which brokers are good at. I would say in general, that is not a problem that I see where you have an amendment that says the option or earnest money shall be converted to option money and paid directly to the seller. The broker reads it, says, okay, well, I've got 10,000, half of it's going to the seller. Let me write a check, and now I have 5,000. I think that's something that we see quite often. Now, if the closing attorney is holding that money, I'm going to be annoyed. I will do it, but it's just more work. I would rather set it up as option money and earnest money ahead of time, or wait until the deal falls apart. And if the deal falls apart, then I'll write two checks, one option money, one to earnest money. That might be more realistic. Sherry asks, can this blank be left blank and still have an enforceable contract? The word plus leads me to believe this is a negotiable item. Yeah, I would say most of the time this is blank. Most of the time, when people aren't using option money, it is completely blank, and that is fine. It's when you start selecting stuff. So if you put in an amount, so seller or buyer shall pay seller additional option money of $5,000, and then you leave everything else blank, I think that's a major problem. And I don't know how to resolve it other than quickly getting back on a phone. Hey, look, closing attorney mentioned, or my audit team mentioned that we've got a major issue because we did not select, how this is paid, when it's paid, and whether it's a credit or not. And that's a major problem. The best advice I can give you is don't let that happen. If you put something in any of these sections, you need to put it in all of them, because the reality is if you've got $5,000 and you can't get back on the same page regarding whether this is refundable or not, like when it's due, the seller is saying, oh, it's due immediately, and the buyer's like, oh, it's due after due diligence. Well, you don't have a meeting of the minds. You don't have two parties on a consummated deal. And I think that's a voidable contract, or a void contract, where it's just not a contract. And so seller could just buy it, sell it to somebody else. Buyer could go buy something else. If I'm the buyer, I'm not writing a check if I don't have those sections all filled out. That's just not acceptable to me. Gemma asks, can you ask for non-refundable money if buyers ask for an extension? Absolutely. In fact, I would recommend it. And what I would use is the option money. So maybe that's the next scenario you could look at, where we didn't use option money up front, but now 30 days in, closing is tomorrow, buyer needs 2 weeks. You say, all right, well, give me $3,000 option money, pay it to me directly right now. You'll get a credit for it at closing, but I'll sign a mutual amendment to extend closing by 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or whatever it may be. I think that's a beautiful option, because you're not writing another earnest money check. You're writing a check directly to the seller. The seller's going to get money to go pay for flooring on their new house, or to pay for the mover, or to pay for storage, for all their stuff, because they were all moved out. We've all seen where sellers are really, really irritated because they've all moved out and now the closing's not actually happening, and we didn't find out about it until this morning. And so if you're being asked to do an amendment, you could do more earnest money. You could waive all contingencies. Maybe the contingencies have already expired, but the option money puts money in the seller's pocket. And I like that as an option. I like that for you guys. What I'll leave you at is, remember that this is not us against them. This is not, trying to mess, to get as much money from the buyer or get lowest prices ever from the seller, whatever it is. It's about coming to a mutual agreement on terms of a deal. And if terms change, we got to be able to put ourselves in their shoes. So if I'm the buyer and I'm asking the seller to wait another 3 weeks, I understand that they're upset. I'm upset. I get it. Well, let me make it up to you. Let me give you some money that you can use to pay for your rent, to pay for your mortgage, that makes you know that I'm for real, that I'm serious. And as the brokers, I think it's your job to remind them that we need to find common ground. We need to find something that works for both of the parties, because the point of the contract is not to get as much option money as possible or to get the most earnest money or the least amount. The point is to close. The point is to close. So with that, I will leave you. Feel free to email me directly if you have questions. I hope you guys can all join me every week that I'm hosting these, and that you continue to enjoy them and you watch all the videos that we have on the YouTube account. I hope that it will only get better. And also, I hope that some of the other attorneys from Camel Brand will join over time. Because I know you guys are so fiercely loyal to us, and we're very grateful for that. So feel free to call us if you have any real estate questions. It's Campbell and Brannon. I'm in the East Cobb office, but honestly, if you need questions answered, just call and I'll help you. It doesn't have to be a closing that our office or even the firm is handling. If you need me, just ask. So my email is in the chat, cross@cb.law. You can also find us online on our website, camelbrandon.com. So this video will be live now. You can watch it again and again and again. And you can also subscribe and get notifications when we add more videos. So thanks, guys. Good luck. Enjoy your week. Happy holidays. And stay safe. Bye, guys.